Hey there, folks. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And why does this week feel like me taking care of business for which everyone else has already moved on? Maybe it's because I've struggled a little bit to find truly great albums in the past couple of episodes. Or maybe it's the fact I'm staring down that J. Cole project next in the docket. Might wind up a solo review. Stay tuned. But before we get to all that, let's get on the pulse. So we got 10 albums on the docket. Let's first go back and talk about From Cadence Weapon, Parallel World.
I shine in the dark, cut your lights off, ice storm like 98. I am the catalyst, peep game like analyst. Don't send a sub at me, I might go stick your battle shit.
Okay, where to start with this guy? The odd thing with Cadence Weapon is when he broke through in 2006, trying to force a marriage between some wordy but clever underground flows and glitchy electropop and house. Even if I wasn't really a fan of the messy fusion, it was a cool experiment, and it was one he would proceed to water down for the next couple of releases until the electronic elements were more of an accent to a pretty smart and forward-thinking rapper in order to fit along with updates for a more contemporary sound. Not exactly one of his distinguishing factors, which when I covered his single Senna several months back on IGTV, it left me intrigued but kind of underwhelmed. Now granted, his material had picked up some refinement in the meantime, and thus with this new project, well, it is interesting. If you're looking for an album that's probably closest in quality to Cadence Weapon's debut, it probably is this one, as this time his brand of stripped-back, clattering hip-hop full of slick synth gurgles and paranoid edges, it feels probably closest to the fusion from which he started, only this time the creeping dread of the modern and distinctly Canadian dystopia for folks of color that he describes feels considerably more pointed. You could almost argue that in returning to a sound just adjacent to his roots, it's more like hip-hop is now finally back to catching up with him, but I also hear some parallels to the more stripped-back material that the Doomtree Collective or Aesop Rock have put out in the past 5 years. And that's not counting some of the grime influences that he's now just outright embracing. They've always been there, but now they're really in the forefront. And it helps his bars highlighting the corporate greed, surveillance, gentrification, and barely veiled systemic racism fits into this sort of futuristic tone effectively, especially in how he directly frames the scenes as distinctly Canadian, from referencing Justin Trudeau's blackface incidents to the utter failures of local Ontario governments to address their community's needs throughout the pandemic. Yeah, I'm feeling him with this one. And I'll admit it hits harder than some of the more bruising braggadocious songs, because this is where I run into a smattering of issues. For one, as an MC, Cadence Weapon doesn't exactly have a super distinctive vocal tone or presence behind the mic, and you can tell that he's underplaying on a fair few songs here and relying on some rougher vocal production to add more of an edge. When Backxwash shows up on Go, she pretty much takes over the entire song, and she's really the most distinctive part of the album. And given how spare, blocky, and minimal a lot of this production is, I'm often left searching for more developed or distinctive melodies or hooks, especially on a project that clocks just under a half hour, paired with some iffy bass mixing on a couple songs, and the feel that maybe a little bit more space and atmosphere could have helped the synth palette breathe a little bit better. I'm still not totally on board with Cadence Weapon, but this was pretty solid. It's him on the upswing, close to his best thus far, so you know what, 7 out of 10. If anything I described is up your alley, give it a listen. Check it out. Next up, from Cicada The Burrower, Corpseflower. Alright, another one-person black metal project, this time leaning on some cleaner, slower prog metal tendencies, and I'll say after a quick exploration of the back catalog, I wasn't initially impressed, mostly courtesy of some muddy mixing that left some admittedly decent melodies kind of stuck in the murk. And while it might have been intentional on the Great Nothing, it just did not really give me that much to work with. And really, it's easy to place this new album in a lot of similar territory. The mixing still feels very muddy, leaving any of the riffs with any sort of edge, struggling to land a lot of true impact in comparison with the more liquid, wheedling rollicks in the guitar and the bass that almost seems closer to something out of post-hardcore or a darker era of early 2000s prog rock, to say nothing about half the snares and the kick drums just sounding completely suffocated. Now, again, I understand why this was done in order to accent some of those prettier melodies, give the album a little bit more tunefulness, and hell, the reason I'm reviewing this at all is because some of those liquid guitar leads, they've got a legit really sweet texture that's pretty magnetic, especially when blended in with some of the pianos on the title track, and that would all be fine if the album didn't also kneecap some of the dynamics that leave some of the raw black metal elements really underpowered, or clashing awkwardly with any vocals that are trying to bring a little bit more visceral presence, be they clean screams or growls, and none of them are all that convincing. But it's also worth noting that there are only vocals out of 3 of the 5 songs here, which takes us to the content and the arc and themes of the album surround how our artist has come out as a trans woman as her faith flickers and fades in the face of a newly realized gender experience, entangled with visceral depression and what it represents for her right now, especially in a black metal space. Now, look, these themes are not really new if you've been listening to trans artists in multiple genres. Again, go back to Backxwash, her album last year in particular, but I'm also not about to deny that being trans in a black metal space is both pretty new and could actually be legit dangerous. And let's be real, it's not like black metal can't also be very one note when it comes to themes and content, if not more so. So I appreciate an artist taking a slightly different tack, and it does add some personal emotive weight I appreciate. And that, combined with the guitar work, really is what makes this worth hearing, especially clocking around a half hour, so it's easy enough to tackle. So even if this does have some issues in the execution, it is still intriguing enough to give it a listen. So yeah, solid 6 out of 10. Give it a shot. Pretty good. Next up from Origami Angel, Gami. Okay, so this is a Midwestern emo act that picked up some hype and even a little bit of critical acclaim off their 2019 debut, and going back to it, yeah, pretty fun stuff. Definitely closer to the pop-punk side when it comes to the melody, the vocals, and a fair amount of the content, if only for as cheery as it is. But the technical complexity in a lot of the compositions did put it a cut above, and the album wound up pretty damn enjoyable. Now, granted, I had some concerns about this new album, given that it had double the number of tracks at 20, and the buzz was suggesting it was a bit of a step down. And yeah, it is, although pinning down why is kind of messier. If anything, it feels caught up between the more adolescent pop-punk vibe and some of the technical complexity of the emo from whence they sprang. A balancing act that's pushed even harder over a longer runtime that somehow finds itself lacking the huge, bright guitar hooks of the former and the emotive depth of the latter, which is kind of a shame because somewhere along the way, it also seems like a lot of the interesting bass lines disappeared too. And that in particular kind of mystified me. Once again, this is self-produced with the same engineer as in 2019. You would have think that would have been something they would have thought to keep intact, but this project just does not have the grooves as nervy or as potent, despite the lead guitar being as chunky as ever. And over a longer runtime, losing some of those low-end dynamics means the tracks start running together and fast, which doesn't help their frontman Rylan Heagy's voice pick up any sort of power, especially when this duo is trying for more hardcore, or any of the Glass Beach-esque synth flourishes that they remotely work, or some of the sampled pieces around the album making them feel profound, because they don't. Now granted, looking for this to be profound is completely missing the point. The feel of this project is more scattered, overwritten snapshots of teenage exuberance, little relatable moments of love or depression or insecurity, peppered with enough teenage relatable details to immerse oneself. The emo soundtrack of your high school arc. So if the album meanders or flows together or goes off on odd detours, that's all the more reflective of that confused experience, right? Well, you know what, again, I won't deny it makes for a pretty immersive experience, but I'm not sure it's always a memorable one. A lot of individual songs that don't really stick out. It's still pretty damn decent, though. Solid 6 out of 10. Understand it's targeting a younger demo than me. Probably will resonate more there. Just saying. Next up from Manchester Orchestra, The Million Masks of God.
Start to distinguish my past and my time. You
I swear, half of my job on this show is going through utterly middle-of-the-road indie rock shoveled out by so many bands across the 2000s that they wind up getting critical acclaim because it's followed by, no, really, these bands helped influence the Midwestern emo scene that you like now, right? Well, apparently folks didn't get the memo that giving me a lot more of the same year after the year can kill your affection for a sound in record time, but fine, Manchester Orchestra. Alright, imagine the intersection between mid-2000s Death Cab for Cutie with your bog-standard guitar-driven indie rock that, around 2017, a decade after they broke through, decided to swap out some of the tasteful Conor Oberst worship with a little bit more multi-track anthemic swell, because this is a band that has always had a lot more broad exuberance than they knew what to do with it. So, fuck subtlety, and you know what, I'll be damned if it didn't kind of work on a Black Mile to the Surface. It wasn't great. Def Havana's alt-rock project from the very same year had a very similar desaturated palette, and that album had a certain amount of muscle that Manchester Orchestra didn't really nail, but it did leave me curious enough to actually give this a chance, and yeah, okay. I get the hype with this one. Now, let's make this clear. There are still some real issues that hold this band back from being truly excellent. The buzzy programmed drum machines that feel a bit too loud, the gauzy synths that crop up often, they don't help. The production palette still feels very monochromatic and reverb saturated and percussion heavy, and it makes the project feel a lot heavier and bleaker than it can conceivably back up. And there is something about Andy Hull's vocal timbre that when it's multi-tracked, it reminds me of Mumford & Sons, for both better and worse, especially given the more intimate dynamics in the content, where this sort of presentation doesn't always resonate well, comes across a bit pompous. And you know what, it strikes me as a little bit odd when you consider just how much of this band's content is now revolving around family, especially in the past two albums, the last one being a concept album with its emotional roots in a family feud, whereas this one is kind of more scattered by necessity, staring in the face of death as their lead guitarist Robert McDowell's father passed away during recording, and a lot of broken connections that you are so desperate to repair, so it swivels back to trying to build, repair, or maintain the family bonds that are being built or that we have now. You can clearly tell this was a project that was written in the wake of lockdown during a pandemic. The parallels are not subtle, where even more of a potent insecurity rides up to the forefront in the face of Hull now becoming a parent and feeling the weight of explaining or protecting his child from an inexplicable world. But you know what? I think that helps the desperate, haunted edge of this album. It's got a bit of a sickly grind that nevertheless can claw forward some legit-ass swell, thanks to some very dreamy acoustic passages, some really well-balanced coursing grooves, the bass lines are fantastic, and terrific hooks on songs like Angel of Death, Telepath, especially Let It Storm, or the explosive bridges of Bedhead and Obstacle. In short, I was legit surprised how much I really wound up liking this. I'm reminded of how well the rock-solid compositional instincts and good writing from Def Havana overcame some dodgy production and surprised me in 2017. I guess it was just a matter of time. So for now, this is a light 8 out of 10. Strong recommendation. Let's see how much more it grows on me. It could happen. Next up from Dodie, Build a
Magical, I can't read your mind. How can you not hear the whole conversation? I'm sitting still with the brain on fire. I know it's an easy, eyes closed isn't helping. When you go quiet, I hate myself.
This is one of those indie folk pop acts for which I've been hearing a decent amount of hype from certain circles, but let's be real. I hear hype for new acts like this every other day. It takes something really special to really grab me. I've said this before, so I went back to the EPs that got all the hype and... Okay, putting aside the fact that there's some very obvious parallels to the more twee and accessible side of indie pop from the late 2000s and early 2010s, I will say the writing, production, and compositional instincts from Dodie were a noticeable cut above, hitting some of that resonance that I kept wishing clicked a little bit more consistently from Phoebe Bridgers last year. So hell, I walked into this with some actual expectations for the album, and yeah, it's pretty damn good, but I'm unfortunately just not head over heels for this one in comparison with some of the hype from the EPs. And honestly, I don't think Phoebe Bridgers is the right comparison at all. In between the very hushed delivery with the very delicate multi-tracking that only breaks in for a bigger swelling crescendo which draw some parallels to that indie pop era that I referenced before. But then you get this very minimal approach to the padded percussion with a little bit more texture and some very thin acoustics. I'm more reminded of someone meeting midway between Billie Eilish and Laura Marling, the latter especially, with the rich and some legit beautiful swells of strings. And that is the thing, there are moments on this project that are so achingly pretty that they're extremely hard to dislike. The remake of When, the outro of Sorry, where she captures that relief of an apology actually landing, the quiet bit of self-assurance on Rainbow, even that illicit tryst on 4 Tequilas Down, it's just romantic enough to actually work. But that's where the album actually gets kind of interesting. For as much as they've got that self-realization, there's enough prodding, transgressive moments where Dodie haltingly bucks against her own instincts or societal expectations of her, and there's a distinctive sense of humanity whenever she acts out of emotion for all of the wrong reasons that I can see really resonating on a fundamental gut level. But I do have two issues. The first being that on her EPs, there's a slightly stronger pop sensibility that feels pulled back considerably this time. The instrumentals are certainly warm, very well arranged, and subtle almost to a fault, whereas a song like Hate Myself sees her straining against passive-aggressive partners. It's probably the most lively cut here, and I did like that. And again, that some of that approach extends to the writing. There's definitely nuance if you read between the lines, but the lines themselves are often so blunt, I found myself looking for a little bit more robust poetry in order to paint that scene, with When, or the re-recording of it, being the best example, and probably Cool Girl being the worst. I've heard that arc a couple of times now, and Dodie comes across a little bit too timid to sell it. Tove Lo, of all people, wound up more convincing. Ultimately, I just wind up circling back to having heard a lot of singer-songwriters play in this territory before, especially in the past decade. I'm just concerned there's not enough here to stick out longer for me, so light 7 out of 10. Definitely good. I want to see where she goes from here. Next up, from Gojira, Fortitude. Now, here's an act I probably should have reviewed first way before, even if my only real opportunity would have been back with Magma in 2016, but here we are. The long-running progressive groove metal act with elements of sludge and death metal, and one for which I've got a complicated relationship. Surprise! Now, you can argue that Gojira was one of the acts coming out of the 2000s that really pushed the whole groove over melody, increasingly over-compressed approach to prog metal that the genre would then drive into the ground in the 2010s. Not really gent, but certainly adjacent to it. And given that the band has consistently had production issues, especially over compression, even on their classic albums, Gojira is a band that I think that I appreciate way more than I actually like them. Or you know what, maybe a band that I like more in small doses. Despite some overlong and occasionally samey sounding albums, they've certainly got some crushing and impressive moments I like, and the persistent environmental themes in a lot of their material, that's a nice feature. And from Mars to Sirius, it is a great album. I get the hype. I also think that it's worth noting that since signing to Roadrunner, their material has gotten a little bit more hook-driven and accessible, again to a point, and that's divided a lot of folks. And I cannot promise my opinion here will be any less divisive, because while I think this is a pretty decent album, not really over the moon about it. Once again, this is a band that feels torn between its and Roadrunner's desire to be a little bit more anthemic and radio-friendly, but also crank out the complicated prog metal passages that highlight, while there are hooks here, I wouldn't really call them stellar, especially if we're comparing them to the heavyweight peers like Baroness or Mastodon. But while the guitar work in both the rhythm and the lead are legit excellent, it's the reason you listen to Gojira, I also think the percussion can sound kind of canned and metallic, which only highlights this is another metal band that really struggles with their sense of dynamics. And I also kind of agree with the criticisms that in going for broader sloganeering, this album can feel a little bit shallow in comparison with their more complex work in the 2000s. But I also argue it's not that steep of a fall off. Gojira has been painting in broad strokes for a while now, and at least the hooks are getting better along the way. I will say I appreciate the development of the hold firm themes on this album, especially when tied into environmentalism, and how sometimes civil disobedience is necessary to pursue this sort of just cause to save the planet. And this band is pretty populist in their framing, but this also feels like an album caught up between a tunefulness that would put their hooks over the top, or a heaviness to make those riffs truly powerful. So we wind up kind of with less of both, and this album's a little bit less interesting as a result. Ergo, it's a very solid 6 out of 10. I hear the appeal. This band's never really been for me, though. I don't quite think it's as bad as some people have made it. I'll say that. Next up from Iceage, Seek.
Beside me, they kick you when you're up, they knock you when you're down. Some shilling from the fighting.
You know, I've been seeing a narrative brewing online among some critics that Iceage is one of those bands that is more of a critical darling than having any actual commercial groundswell, and thus they might be one of those bands that might be worth a sober second look to see if the hype has actually been worth it. And as someone who has actually routinely highly praised Iceage albums since Plowing Into the Field of Love brought forth that cacophonous, tender prey-esque thunder in 2014, but also hasn't been in a big hurry to revisit Iceage, I went back to revisit their last 2 albums, and well, okay, putting aside this is pretty much true for every sense of experimental rock act and a lot of post-punk too, maybe there might be a note of truth to that. Their sound has always had a lot of textural appeal, and it got a few standout cuts every time, but maybe the shambling mess was a little bit too beholden to some of its influences, or didn't have quite the stronger resonant hooks or writing to stick longer. Well, I wanted to test this hypothesis on Seek Shelter, especially as they've now added the production from the frontman of cult rock band Spaceman 3 and Sonic Boom, and immediately you can really hear a shift with this. Now, some of the groundwork had already been laid in the more relaxed and accessible moments on Beyondless, but some of that crushing, guttural cacophony has been eased back even further. Elias Ronenfeld's vocals are just as theatrical, but he's slinging in a slightly higher register with a borderline Britpop sneer at points, an impression only accented by the guitars, which remain as loud as ever, across a mix where the blues, the rockabilly, and even some country influences on the grooves are even more pronounced. This is the farthest the band has bent away from post-punk ever, and by extension some of that phenomenal atmosphere has been pulled away for something that's more tuneful or accessible or refined. I mean, if you can count obviously early 70s Rolling Stones influence as refined, and yet I'm not sure this is to Iceage's benefit, especially as this sort of restraint doesn't always flatter or amplify the grooves or hooks that they do have. I don't know, it just gives me the uneasy feeling that the underlying compositions don't quite have the same impact when you peel the atmosphere away, and some of that also feels like a factor of the lyrics. A lot of critics have made the Nick Cave comparison with Iceage, including myself, but on this album, it does feel a little less appropriate. When Nick Cave stripped things back for his considerations of faith and weaving beauty out of ugliness, and vice versa, that was tied a lot to narratives and storytelling, whereas Iceage is way more impressionistic and fanciful, even romantic. And again, this isn't new from them, but with less atmosphere to rely upon, the more scattered approach to composition and lyrics can feel a bit underweight. Hell, I don't even have to point to Kyle Craft this time. Shoo Shoo's album this year feels sharper across the board, and it went for more and just brought a pop sensibility. Now, that's not saying there aren't some potent moments here. The flip of Will the Circle Be Unbroken and the snarling deconstruction of High and Hurt, the harmonicas blasting over Gold City, the terrific groove on Dear Saint Cecilia. But this is a slightly less interesting version of Iceage, not quite having the textures that grab me. As such, it doesn't really wow me. 7 out of 10. Man, that next Kyle Craft album cannot come fast enough. Next up, from Morray, Street Sermon.
Quick bands, falling in deep with the quicksand. Flag on my ass, no quick brand. I was packing on the ground, got my weight up. Hot beef in the streets, I can stay up. Betty Crocker showed me how to bake a cake, bro. Doing that, put everything I ever stake, bro.
Now, I've been looking forward to talking about this guy since Quicksand broke. Someone stepping into a parallel lane to Rod Wave with tighter flows, a bit more refinement, and Morray seemed to have the pipes and presence to be worthy competition, especially as Rod Wave's growth has only seemed to come in patches or isolated songs. And now, having heard this whole thing multiple times, While I will say I don't think there's a song here that's better than Street Runner, Morray does have one hell of a debut that does deserve a fair bit more attention and scrutiny than it's gotten, basically by presenting a considerably more polished approach to this particular sound in trap and R&B. He's a much more aggressive presence on the microphone, for one, and that translates to a level of technical control and poise that doesn't quite feel as organically soulful, but also has way more polish and focus, especially when it comes to storytelling and delivering much stronger hooks. Now, I still think the overall formula, the liquid guitars and the dreary keys behind the trap percussion, could use a little bit more variation at this point, and some of the drum machines here do sound a bit thinner or cheap, but even there's a sense of consistent mastering and momentum and flow that gives a lot of individual songs more punch, so this doesn't feel as one note, puts some overwrought wave there. And that also reflects Morray's content, which might seem on first glance to fall into a lot of similar trap come-up narratives, but it's got a very different flavor than a lot of the downbeat, emo-adjacent trends in the genre. I'd say there's more in the content that parallels might be more Lil Baby than Rod Wave, but even then, Morray has this fierce, desperate, borderline evangelical streak to how he frames his ethos of hard work to get out of the streets. And frankly, given a lot of the frankness in which he describes the poverty from which he came on songs like Reflections, I kind of get where he's coming from. Now, I will say it makes for a very distinctive tone to a breakup song like Nothing Now, which might be one of the more layered but brutally effective trap kiss-offs I've heard in a while. But I'll also say by the time this project settles into the more paranoid moments, clapping back at friends who betrayed him, you can tell that the populism on this project kind of wears thin really fast. And I got other nitpicks. A little bit more variation in the production would help. Again, the Chris Paul reference on Swished Up really did not age well now that he's on the Suns. But miraculously, after so much anger and intensity, the album actually ends on an optimistic note. Because yeah, it does feel better to do better than he did last year. And this is a prime example. Very solid 7 out of 10. It's getting slept on. You'll want to fix that. Next up, the self-titled album from Shelley FKA DRAM. I'm shocked this took 5 years. And it's one of those cases where I'm not sure where the problem was. The artist formerly known as Drum had a terrific breakthrough single in 2016 with so much charisma and flair that even if I didn't completely love his debut, there was enough energy and varied texture to keep him on my radar and got him a touring spot opposite Travis Scott, Kendrick Lamar in 2017. I saw that tour, he was great. And then, well, it turns out he felt hemmed in by just being known for Broccoli. He wanted to embrace the soulful side of him that often got overlooked by the casual fans, and that meant a new name, a long break to solidify the rebrand. Now, given I liked both sides of what he had put forward, I was curious where this album was gonna go. Really, I'm not really surprised by it, but there was a part of me that was expecting a little more. Now, some of this was inevitable, as I was someone who really actually liked Shelley's knack for loose humor and groove on the poppier songs. He is such an outsized, likable personality that made so much sense in pop, and I thought he got a really raw deal with only Broccoli getting massive success. He deserved way more. Misunderstood should have been a hit. But I also think that some of this is the era of soul throwback that Shelley's pulling from, which is more reminiscent of very late 70s and the early 80s in R&B, when cooler synthesizers and sharper drum machines began taking hold instead of the more lush arrangements and supple grooves in the mid-70s. And I've mentioned this preference in the past, but it's just not an era in soul and R&B I like quite as much, especially with Shelley leaning into the more thicker and more modern bass beats and sharper but stiffer percussion that don't quite pick up the same groove. It's still very buttery and smooth, and he's got the expressive vocal presence and charisma to make it work, and even bring a little bit of quirkiness to the Daft Punk cover Something About Us, but minus more of that sense of playful humor that used to be his standby. This album has a very different feel. It's a lot more old school, more self-serious, more mature, and I don't know, I'm just not sure it was the best pick for all of the album, even if you got her and Erykah Badu as natural fits, Watt for a guitar solo, and Chad Smith of the Red Hot Chili Peppers for drum work on the laydown, probably the album's standout, and Summer Walker shocker for the very obvious point of crossover as a single. Atlantic, what are you doing not pushing it? And what's exasperating is that given the success of this sort of slow burn R&B and soul on the Hot 100 this year, he's probably primed to smash through. But without that bit of added lyrical flair or a little more spark, I feel like this might have been a lateral move that's a more consistent album, but doesn't quite capture the unique sparkle of the best moments of Big Baby Drum outside of maybe the two closing songs, Remedies and Rich and Famous, which also translates to a few songs that just kind of ran together or fell into the background in the midsection of the album, like Married Woman. Me and Mrs. Jones, This Is Not. But it does kind of remind me a little bit too much of the late Billy Paul's 80s output, if you catch my drift. But you know what, a lateral move from good to, well, still really good, so solid 7 out of 10, exceptionally easy to enjoy. If you like that era of retro soul I described, you'll probably like it even more. And finally, from Weezer, Van Weezer.
I'm incomplete without you. I guess we've reached the end of the game. Ooh, hit me.
You'd think I'd learned, given the response to my Weezer review from earlier this year, or the fact I was proven right in all my comparisons between Weezer and AJR when they announced a collaboration to drop this past week. But no, this was the project that's been teased since 2019, Weezer making yet another slice of nostalgia bait, half directed at the cock rock, hair metal of the mid-80s, and half of their own nostalgia, quasi-ironic sound across the 2000s that has aged, let's be nice and say haphazardly. Now, I had serious doubts about this right from when it was announced, especially in the 80s rock pastiche, because A, I've had a fondness for this era of hard rock for way longer than I probably should have, past 20 years. That means I am very familiar with this subgenre and era. B, a lot of this sound was heavily dependent on the 80s bigness of the production, and Weezer's producer this time around was Susie Shin, who I discovered is most well known for her work on late period Panic at the Disco and Fall Out Boy. And C, as I mentioned in my OK Human review, not since the Matt Sharp years has Weezer been known for their compositional prowess or technical skills, and you're gonna need at least some of those if you're gonna try to imitate Van friggin' Halen. I bring all this up because in my comparison with my well-documented issues of the Rivers Cuomo as a lyricist, I'll be real, the bar for wit, intelligence, even good taste, it's way lower here, even for Weezer. So in the grand tradition of setting criminally low expectations for this band, I can actually say there's a bit more that can be appreciated from Van Weezer than even OK Human. Going back to pure, stupid, maladroit era, guitar-driven music somewhere between power pop and hard rock, with the occasional bit of decent metal-adjacent shredding, where you can tell the framing is padlocked into nostalgic wish fulfillment. It's about the only way this works, and you know what? There are moments where it kinda does. Yeah, there is a layer of tinny overcompression over way too many of the songs, and the bass and the drums remain painfully underwhelming as per usual, and the hand claps sound fake as all hell, and Rivers Cuomo has nowhere close to the pipes to sell any of the retro rock or metal that he's trying to imitate. But again, this is an album with the childlike, earnest exuberance of trying desperately to imitate one's legends, especially with every notable riff the band is cribbing from classic rock. They're basically playing Guitar Hero. And yeah, I would understand why Weezer would want to dive headfirst in the pure rock star fantasy that so many young guys have, but there's two major problems. First being, Rivers Cuomo's 50, and more importantly, he already did some of this with Maladroit and Make Believe. Now he's just stripping out the irony and it winds up feeling more like a midlife crisis. The other problem is that this is just not especially well executed. I already mentioned the production issues, but while there are moments that are trying to be a little bit more empathetic and progressive in comparison with that era, you're still dealing with a Weezer with their simping, whining, and weirdly chosen pop culture references that don't fit and don't help pull away from the lingering immaturity of all this. And yes, I know that's part of the point, but you could have done more. More disappointingly, you'd think the band would actually try to make at least one blow at the speakers anthemic jam, and yet the plaintive lyrics and Rivers Cuomo's hangdog delivery seem to undercut all of it. So that epic fist-pumping bigness or heaviness never really materializes. And without any sort of real commentary or deeper subtext on this era or even nostalgia, just feels like Weezer can't even execute their own sincere tribute. They can't even rise to the darkness. And there's a part of me that kind of sees a whiff of what happened with the Teal and Black albums in the promotion of this that makes me think that Weezer knows they didn't quite stick the landing. Van Weezer has inspired more shrugs than actual discourse, which is why on the week they released this, they announced the remix from OK Human featuring AJR. Incidentally, called it. And you know, it's kind of a shame, because the guitar work and the hooks are legit pretty good here on cuts like The End of the Road. So even this all feels like a half-formed copy of a copy, there were glimmers that could have worked. So very light 5 out of 10. Not worth hating, but the execution's way too thin to care even more. In other words, your average mid-tier Weezer album. We've been down this road a few too many times. But yeah, thanks a lot for watching. If you'd like to like and subscribe, I'd be more than grateful. I'm sure I said many a thing that is controversial. Comments are down there. Have fun. Beyond that, anything else I might be able to do to improve my presentation, I'm all ears. If you want to subscribe to see more, again, only about half of you do, but if the other half want to hop on board, you're welcome. And if you guys want to get involved in my scheduling process or help support the channel, link to my Patreon is right over there. Once again, please don't feel obligated, tough times out there, but if you want to, options available. But until then, I'm Mark, you're watching On the Pulse on Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.